Hey everyone, just a quick disclaimer for this episode. I was on baby duty today while recording an episode, and because we've had a busy couple of weeks, I also happened to be recording it pretty much the day that I also wanted to release it. Around the 20-minute-ish mark, the baby wakes up, and I am taking care of him in the room while recording, so there's a lot of times where I'm having to pause the recording, go deal with him, and then come back to it, and you can kind of hear him fidgeting in the background. I hoped that it wouldn't catch on a lot of the recording, but yeah, you can kind of hear him crawling around, and now and then he pipes up and contributes his opinions about Pillars of Eternity every now and then, most of which were not PC. He's a baby, so he doesn't really care what people think of him, so he has some pretty harsh opinions, so I had to cut most of them out. I did, however, include a couple moments of him talking, just because, I think it's cute. I first want to just hope you pardon my unprofessionalism of allowing some of that noise in the background and all that. I thank you for your patience with that, and I hope it doesn't interrupt the podcast too much for you. But yeah, it shouldn't interrupt most of the content. So I will endeavor to have a more isolated and secure place to record the podcast from in the future. But thank you. I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you guys so much for joining me on another episode where we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. For those who don't know why we pair Avowed with the Pillars of Eternity games, it's because they have the same fantasy setting known as Eora. So as we get excited for Avowed to come out, it makes sense to look back at the Pillars of Eternity games and see what kind of insights we can get from looking at how it works, as well as understand the world that this game is going to be played in, as well as just, opportunity for those of us who are geeks about these games and this world to dive into it and see what's going on. As usual, no news on the Avowed or Pillars of Eternity front, but I promise you if anything comes up, I'll put it right here for you guys. Today we're going to be talking about various political and religious factions that you obviously interact with through the Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, but we're also going to be discussing some factions that you don't actually interact with in the games. You only hear about them through the lore outside of the games, like in the guidebooks or the collector's edition stuff, blah, 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 blah. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. And any one of these factions that we discuss could make their way into Avowed, or something like them could make their way into Avowed. With that said, let's just dive straight into the lore for the day.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So first, I'm going to go to Pillars of Eternity 1, the first volume, the first guidebook, and we're going to look at some of the factions that exist there. In the first section, we're dealing with a city called Defiance Bay. Now, if you've played the game Pillars of Eternity 1, you're familiar with Defiance Bay. You spend a lot of time there. And you're also probably going to be familiar with the main factions that are there as well, considering as part of the main quest line, you have to align yourself with one of those three factions in order to have a hearing at the end of the second act. But I'm not going to get too much into the spoilers of those quest lines, but suffice it to say that you have to align yourself with one of these factions. I do believe there are ways to actually go around that and not align with any faction, but the game does definitely encourage you to try to align yourself with one of these three factions. So in Defiance Bay, the first three factions that we're going to talk about are Knights of the Crucible, the Dozens, and House Doemenal. Starting off with the Dozens, because that's the first one we get in the book. The Dozens are a self-organized militia of Deerwooden nationalists. Deerwoodens are the name of the colonists for the area of Defiance Bay. They originate from the nation of Adir, but they have recently, in the past century or so, gained their independence. Their name and bylaws commemorate the sacrifice of the 12 soldiers who died on Avon-Dur Bridge during the last battle of the Saints' War. For context there, the Saints' War is a very recent war that went on in the Deerwood. And there was this invading army from another place called Rayad Saris to the north, and apparently the leader of this religious army was inhabited by a god named Aethys. And they managed to devise a plan to destroy this Aethys man known as Widewin, and they blew him up essentially at a bridge called Avowed. And so that was the height of the Saints' War in the Dyrwood, where this religious army was invading, as they basically blew up a god man, but at personal sacrificial cost to these 12 soldiers. Their meeting halls are decorated with portraits of the 12, scenes of combat with a tyrannical god of light, and devotional paintings of the Godhammer bomb, which was the name of the bomb they used to destroy the godman. So fervently do they praise the success of the battle that they place blood, or soul, relatives of the original dozen at the highest levels of leadership. Okay, so a little backstory there. Placing blood or soul as the original dozens for the highest levels of leadership. In this world of Eora, the world runs on a cycle of reincarnation. So basically, if you lived in this world, you died, your body dies, but your soul uncouples from your body, goes into the afterlife, to put it bluntly, stays there for a bit and comes back and enters into a new body. And then, therefore, you have a new person. The unique mixture of soul with body makes the unique new person. But these souls are what continue on. And so, through the use of different magical or scientific means, you can actually look into the past lives of souls. And so the members of the dozens, this group of self-organized militia, if they can peer into an inductee's soul's past and discover that their soul has actually belonged to one of the original dozen, then that person will have a higher ranking within the dozens. This group is named after these dozen soldiers that were there when the Godhammer bomb blew up Widewin on the bridge. So obviously, if you have one of those 12 souls inside of you, you're a pretty important person in this group. Maintaining extensive documents on the heritage of their founders, they track the activity of descendants in order to keep the thread of their patron and patroness soldiers in check. If any potential recruit expresses reluctance to join, the dozens are not above using intimidation to force the matter. So it sounds to me like if they do find someone who has one of those 12 souls, they will make you join one way or another. Their guiding beliefs focus on cultural exclusivity and xenophobia, particularly when it comes to Rhaed Saris and the worship of Aethys. After the death of Saint Widewin, belligerent groups of Dyrwoodans tracked down the followers of Aethys and forced them to flee north. Okay, so the things that are going on here. I've already mentioned Rhaed Saris, which was the army that came from the north, the religious army that came and was invading the Dyrwood. Saint Widewin, if I didn't already mention it, was the person that Aethys, the god, was inhabiting. So you have this man, Widewin, and then the god Aethys. And Aethys inhabited the vessel, the physical vessel of Saint Widewin, and led the charge on the Dyrwood with this religious army. Or at least this is how the story is presented. And as you can imagine, the fact that the dozens are essentially putting on a pedestal these dozen soldiers that were on the bridge that blew up St. Widewin, who was inhabited by Aethys, you can imagine that the dozens are not very favorable to people who consider themselves Aethasian followers. So if you belong to an Aethasian faith, you're not going to be on good terms with the dozens, which is interesting, actually, because you can play Pillars of Eternity 1 as an Aethys priest. Whether or not you let them know that, I suppose, is up to you. But there's some interesting interactions you can have from that. Rural areas were especially prone to all manner of frontier justice. As the Purge slowed its momentum, the most ardent and invested mobs joined forces to continue the bloody work. There's a little blurb here, kind of interrupting the paragraph. It looks like it's a pamphlet that is circulated around a place called New Yarma, and I think it's a pro-dozens material. And it says the following: "Candle worshippers, be warned. A light is easily spotted in the shadows. We know where you are. You don't even know us. No one is protecting you. We are Legion. You have a dead god. We have the dozens." So the fact that the dozens are willing to both create and circulate material like this, where they are kind of like threatening Aethasian followers, tells you a little bit about kind of what they're like as an organization, and whether or not you think you'd like to align yourself with a group like that. The more extremist members still advocate a war of reprisal against Rhaed Saris. On several occasions since the war, they've been known to drive outsiders from their protected communities using violence and coercion. Though the actions of the dozens are widely considered terrible expression of vigilantism, it is suspected that they have a quiet majority of support, even in the highest level of the Dyrwoodan government. So, This part's interesting because it kind of tells you a little bit of the outcome of the Saints' War. After the Godhammer bomb blew up Avondor Bridge and St. Widewin, who was inhabited by Aethys, I think that pretty much ended the war. But there was a lot of voices in the Dyrwood saying that they should retaliate and they should invade Raid Saris and that they should make them pay for what they did. But as far as I understand it, they didn't really launch an all-out war against Raid Saris. They just sort of ended the war and then that was it. But it seems like the Dozens are one of those voices calling out for, retributive action, and that they also probably have a lot of quiet majority support even in the Dyrwooden government. That's one of the main factions within the city of Defiance Bay, one of the groups that have a lot of political leeway and leverage and power. The next one is the Knights of the Crucible, and you might have heard me talk about them a few times. So here we have the Knights of the Crucible. A knight is arguably a misnomer for this motley band of Defiance Bay mercenaries. The faction employs anyone from street thugs to starchy veterans. Those who join the ranks must necessarily be hardened by years of battle. In this sense, the Knights are a fiercely practical meritocracy. Okay, so far we're getting a decent idea of what the Knights of the Crucible are. This is another one of the factions within the city of Defiance Bay, the main colonized city within the Dyrwooden nation. The Knights of the Crucible are just these kind of group of mercenaries who take people that have years of combat experience, and that they are also a meritocracy, so it's based on service. The coalition of fighting profiteers assembled during the War of Defiance. Okay, so the coalition of fighting profiteers assembled during the War of Defiance. The War of Defiance was the pinnacle war, I would say, in a series of wars where the Dyrwooden nation achieved its independence from its mother nation, the Aedir Empire, which is across the ocean, far, far, far to the west. So that War of Defiance was kind of the partnering between the Dyrwooden colonists and the Airglanfathan tribes, which were native to the area, and they fought against Aediran armies in order to achieve their independence as a nation. And so that's what they are now. And when you play Pillars of Eternity 1, you're playing in the Free Palatinate of the Dyrwood, which I believe is a contradiction in terms. If you're a Palatinate, you're not free, but they call themselves the Free Palatinate. But regardless, so the War of Defiance is how Dyrwood achieved its independence from its mother nation. And the Knights of the Crucible were very involved in this entire conflict. They were a major player during that conflict, and they're a large part of the reason why there was any victory at all. They hired out their blacksmithing skills and fought in both minor and major skirmishes. Since then, the Knights have only grown in martial prowess as a popularity swelled in their ranks. So obviously the Knights being, a major player within the War of Defiance that got this nation its independence, the Knights have grown in popularity. People really respect them for what they've contributed. But whether or not they've maintained this level of notoriety or they've been able to keep on the mission and vision of how they started off, we'll find out. Because of their modest roots in blacksmithing, the Knights of the Crucible regard Abaddon as their patron deity. Abaddon is one of the 11 deities that exist within the World of Eora's universe. He is the god of hard working and good times. He's the god of trades work. He's the god of blacksmithing. He's the god of the forge. He's the god of creativity. Well, not creativity, that's more Hylia. But yeah, so the Abaddon would be the patron deity for this group, especially considering that they are really into blacksmithing. All sorts of tradespeople will worship Abaddon as kind of their patron deity. Admiration of the kinship with the Arm of Magran, which is another name for Abaddon if I remember correctly, reflect their values of hard work and self-improvement through labor, which is easily one of the biggest pillars within the Abaddon faith, valuing hard work, self-improvement through labor. To a knight, quote-unquote talent, is not something found in a vacuum. It's the result of constant practice and rigorous training. So the knights would believe that you don't have talent innately. It's something that you earn. It's something that you make within yourself. It's something that you own through years and years of work. And they would probably say that if you've stumbled across someone who had quote-unquote natural talent, it's because they've actually secretly been practicing in that skill, even if they weren't doing it on purpose, right? And there's something to be said about that, because I think that there used to be this assumption and this is I'm talking real world now, Earth world, that like there's a lot of people who used to think things like intelligence, for example, was a static thing. You were just as smart as you were. Some people used to think that your skill level when it came to certain things, especially even related to work, was static. You couldn't change it. You could maybe get a little better or worse, but there was some threshold that people couldn't cross. And me personally, I think that like within reason, of course, that a person can pretty much improve their skills as long as they continue practicing. And a lot of these things are not static numbers. You know, you can always increase your skill level at things. You can always learn new things. And so in that regard, I do agree that constant practice and rigorous training, just like the knights say here, can result in this quote-unquote talent, but to a degree. Those who keep close to Defiance Bay serve long-term contracts on the City Watch, an elevated position coveted and vied for by other subgroups within the Knights. The Knights of the Crucible are closely tied to, I would say, the City Guard. In fact, in a lot of ways, they pretty much are just the City Guard. And they do have a hierarchy, and so there are these positions for other people to vie for. In spite of their success, the Knights are deeply divided over their factions' commercial and philosophical goals. Whether they aspire to a traditional knighthood or the rough and tumble ways of the dozens may depend entirely on which group collects the most coin. So there's kind of an identity crisis within the Knights of the Crucible themselves. You know, they got together when their War of Defiance was happening, and they just banded together and they did what needed to be done under this common philosophy. But now that they're still trying to continue existing after the war's over, like I said, their identity is fragmented. They're not 100% sure who or what they really are. And through the actions of the player character in the first game, you can help them kind of figure some of that stuff out depending on your choices. But it's also really evident, too, when you interact with them, that there are clearly some different people within this group have ideas on what the Knights of the Crucible even are. And there's a internal conflict going on, which, you know, happens to any sort of institution after enough time existing and it gets so big. The last main faction to discuss for Defiance Bay is House Doemenal. The House Doemenal is the last of the three factions that your player can align with in order to have a seat at the Animancy hearings at the end of Act 2. They're a little bit more of the shady criminal organization archetype, you know, if you're going for that kind of thing. You've got the dozens who are kind of the militant, opinionated extremists. You have the Knights of the Crucible, which try to be a little more lawful good, but they have some corruption inside. And then you also have House Doemenal, who are like, we get things done, and we also do a bunch of shady stuff because it makes us rich, I guess. House Doemenal. The Doemenals once counted themselves among Deerwood's wealthiest aristocratic families, and that's an important thing to note. House Doemenal is just a family house that people work for. When the War of Defiance began, they quietly kept their Aediran alliances with hopes of enduring the conflict unscathed and richer for the effort. So they had Aediran alliances which were making them rich, but the War of Defiance was Deerwood against Aedir. So naturally they had to kind of learn to live within the shadows, because if people found out that they were allied with Aedir, oh boy, that would have not gone well for them during the War of Defiance. Unfortunately for the Doemenals, Duke Admeth's supporters uncovered their treason and repurposed the lion's share of their fortune to finance the rebellion. So okay, they eventually did get found out. They didn't just get completely disbanded, which, lucky them, I guess. But they did lose most of their large wealth. So they are trying to get a lot of that back, I think, by the time you're playing the game. High-ranking members of the family grudgingly cooperated and were allowed to keep the remains of their estate and dignity. These days, the Doemenals are aristocrats only in the criminal underworld. The family of accomplished swindlers, thieves, assassins, and black market traders are well connected and established across Defiance Bay, keeping a strictly cloak and dagger level of involvement. The Doemenals nevertheless look forward to the day when they can elevate back to a semblance of their former glory. So there you have it, House Doemenal, a backstabbing, treasonous family group who are trying to nickel and dime their way through the criminal world back to some sort of aristocratic glory. A fun group to join in a lot of ways. I know I did all three of the quest lines for these factions almost up to the end. You know how you are when you play RPGs, right? You get a quest, you play it as far as you can go before you piss one of the other NPCs off. And then you go and play the other NPC's quest until you almost piss another one off. Pretty typical gamer thing, I think. Or is it just me? I don't know. Those are the three main political factions that you have to ally your character with, but there are more factions within Defiance Bay and the Deerwood in a grander scale. One such group is called Dunryd Row, which I always thought was Dunryd Row or Dinard or something like that, because I would always misread it, but it's Donryd, and it's Dunryd Row. Dunryd Row, in short, is basically espionage, spies, stuff like that. They're an intelligence agency, essentially. But we'll read about them right here. Dunryd Row. 50 years after the founding of Brackenbury Sanitarium, which is a safe haven within Defiance Bay to do animancy research. Animancy is the science where they study souls, and Brackenbury Sanitarium is a place to study that. It's also, I think it's called a sanitarium because souls are tied to your psyche and to your consciousness and to your morality, and so doing studies on that kind of thing, especially people who have, psyche disorders or something like that, they look to people on the outside crazy, when really it's a malady of their soul. It's like an actual concrete soul malady that's bothering them. So hence the name sanitarium. 50 years after the founding of Brackenbury Sanitarium, the Deerwood government recognized another opportunity to utilize soulcraft to the country's benefit. Ambassadors from the Animancy community visited Glonfathan tribes and consulted with their specialist, quote-unquote, mind hunters, or ciphers. The Glonfathan tribes were the native tribes that lived in this area before the Deerwooden colonists arrived from across the sea. And these special mind hunters that the Glonfathans had, with these elite psychic warriors, I guess you can call them. The native tongue called them Brishalgwyn. They're essentially ciphers, and I just did a episode on ciphers, so you can listen to that if you want to know what they are. These figures had cultivated latent psychic abilities, which they used to identify dissenters in the tribal ranks or track elusive prey. I discussed at length in the last couple episodes, I think, about the powers that you can have through these kind of psychic abilities. They're not really psychic in the typical sense. I don't know how you have a typical sense of psychic powers, but it's more of a one person being able to interact with souls of another thing. Their unique skills were instrumental when Duke Admeth, which is the leader of the Deerwood at the time, rooted out Imperial agents from among his trusted allies. At first wary of sharing their practices, the Glonfathans eventually acknowledged the benefit of using animancy in tandem with their cipher abilities. So we're seeing the budding symbiotic relationship that can exist here. The Deerwoodens are a little more well-versed in the science of animancy, which is understanding how the mechanics of all this stuff works in the soul's world. But the Glonfathans have got a lot of skill in actually navigating the waters of, reading people's minds and using soul powers and cipher abilities to, perform things like read minds or read objects, look into the past of people. So there's, they can learn from each other. And so both of those factions are starting to realize that they can learn from each other. The relationship progressed to the point that ciphers allowed their animancer allies access to the Ingwithan sites, where they practiced and known to their abilities. Now, this is really important because what that means is that the reason it's important is because there were all these wars that were going on between the Deerwoodens and the Glonfathan tribes. And really, it's a big deal because what fueled a lot of this war between these two factions was the fact that the Deerwoodens were invading these Ingwithan sites that the Glonfathan tribes considered sacred. We had major wars in the history of the Deerwood because of that reason. And now, not only is there peace between these two warring nations, but they're actually working together on these very sites that were the contention of those wars in the first place. So that's how important this is in the history of the Deerwood. This cultural exchange program reached its apex in 2799 AI. AI is the designation for the calendar. For context, you play Pillars of Eternity somewhere in the early 2800s, when Lady Idis Webb petitioned for the formation of a cipher secret police in Defiance Bay. She envisioned the group as a covert enforcement team under her direct command. Most wore no uniform and often communicated using obscure codes. Specifically targeted eligible ciphers who looked ordinary and blended in with the crowd. By design, they operated beneath the attention of the government, the people, and even their fellow agents. So you can see, just looking at all and just hearing all this, that she's coming up with, a secret police. These people who look like just regular mundane people, but have innate cipher abilities, which means they can read minds, they can read souls, and they can interact with things like that. Despite what you may or may not think about the morality of this thing, it definitely makes for good fantasy. Or for a great D&D game, by the way, if you're thinking along those lines. Lady Itis further utilized this information network to learn as much as possible about developments in soulcraft, most likely to serve her personal ambition. Among her other responsibilities, the team monitored the activity of questionable animancers. For this reason, the group was largely composed of Glonfathans and utterly devoid of Aedirans. And this makes sense because the Glonfathans are the ones who are the most skilled in practicing cipher abilities and cipher magic, whereas Deerwoodens are really good at practicing the science behind it. But when you're out in the field, you don't have time to set up a lab, so that makes sense. And being utterly devoid of Aedirans, mostly because, well, they were against a lot of Aedir back in those times, War of Defiance and all that. Once the public grew alert to the presence of the force of their midst, locals responded with paranoia and mistrust. I can't imagine why. Outraged propaganda circulated in the streets, dubbing the Mystery Coalition as Dunryd Row, named after the section of the city where they conducted their affairs. They currently operated out of a vine-shrouded house in the Brackenberry district, bringing their mental abilities to bear on the city's ongoing protection. So, in playing the first Pillars of Eternity game, you're actually able to interact with Dunryd Row. And I believe, actually, the city of Defiance Bay was originally called New Dunryd. And I'm guessing Dunryd was a place over in the original Mother Nation of Aedir, and that's why they call it New Dunryd. There's a couple other factions that we're going to focus on before we end today's episode. We're not going to get through them all, as I've discovered. One of which I've talked about before on the show. It's called the Society of the Talon. The Society of the Talon is essentially a hunting lodge group. They started off back before Deerwood was its own nation, and there's a bunch of people who would get together and tell stories about hunting, even though a lot of them didn't hunt. But they ended up evolving into a group that started hunting dragons, or at least collecting dragon lore. I've read their lore on a different episode when I did something on dragons, so if you're interested in learning about the Society of the Talon, this old hunting lodge that hunts dragons and collects dragon lore, go ahead and listen to that episode. Another faction, which I'm not going to go into length about here because I think they are worthy of their own episode because we see them in both Pillars games, is the Hand Occult, which is a order of people that follow the god Wal, the god of mysteries and revelations and secrets and dreams and all that kind of stuff. And the Hand Occult they've got their hands in everything, actually, and I really love them. They're fascinating, but in this book, there's really only a small amount to go through anyways, and so I'll read some of the blurb here, but not all of it because I don't want to have to reread a lot of this stuff in an episode just for themselves. But this is a little bit about the Hand Occult. It is perhaps appropriate that Hand's objective is cloaked in mystery, as the members of this order are followers of the god Wal, who is a god of mystery. And the Hand Occult are primarily a coalition of scribes and writers who circulate information through popular books and periodicals, most notably Almanac of the Eastern Reach for colonists, explorers, and curiosity seekers. This almanac is actually a book that you can read if you have Pillars of Eternity on PC, or if you look into the game files, if you have, I think, the definitive edition or the collector's edition, you can actually find this almanac as a PDF in your game files. So yeah, the Hand Occult are primarily scribes and writers, and their main purpose... I'm joined by my son, by the way, so you're hearing him in the background. Hey, buddy, you gonna say hi? He's just interested in grabbing the microphone. So these Hand Occult writers and scribes are most interested in either getting information out that is being hidden by people or hiding information that people are trying to circulate. And you can never understand why they hide one set of information and spread others. They're a really interesting group to look at, and they're one of the main factions that you look at through the Forgotten Sanctum DLC in Pillars of Eternity 2. The next and last group that I'm going to look at today is the Hounds of Galawain. The Hounds of Galawain are a quasi-religious order dedicated to the god of the hunt, and that's Galawain. Aside from their passion for stalking greater beasts, members of the group hire themselves out as guides for wilderness expeditions. History has shown that seeking treasure in Ingwithan ruins without the aid of a hound will likely result in untimely death or disappearance. Consequently, a small contingent of hounds also can be found in the Expedition Hall, which is a location in Defiance Bay, making themselves available to adventurers wishing to contract the services of professionals. In keeping with Galawain's proclivity for turnabout in the hunt, the hounds most frequently target alpha predators or one-of-a-kind creatures spawned by the father of monsters, which is another name for Galawain. It generally follows that a hunt or mission must be of the utmost challenge or utmost profit to be worth their effort. So you get an idea of who the Hounds of Galawain are. There's these hunters, which is a form of worship towards the god Galawain, who hire themselves out to help guide people, first off, but also to engage in some high challenge hunts, and to make a name for themselves in that ways, and thereby glorify the god Galawain. Joining the company requires that the initiate plumb the depths of the Deerwooden Wilderness and hunt a sufficiently formidable creature, example, wolf, bear, great cat, or one of Galawain's unique creations. As the prey dies, the hunters perform a ritual devouring in order to absorb the creature's soul into him or herself, gaining a measure of its power and instinct. Galawain is a lot about that, about consuming the essence and power of one person for the strength of yourself. He really does support the strong eat the weak mentality. When you're playing Pillars of Eternity, you can have a mission with him where he can ask you to do something. And I'm going to be as spoiler-free about this as I can. But essentially, he asks you, the player character, to sacrifice a great amount of, we'll say, people, so that a large group of others can become stronger. And in a way, it sounds pretty awful depending on your worldview. But that is how Galawain operates. It's the strong eat the weak. And when others perish, it can be to the benefit of others. It's not necessarily strong eat the weak in the sense of everything has to devour each other. Like, even a scholar, someone who's just academically inclined, can be a servant of Galawain. And instead of doing great hunts in the wilderness, he can do great hunts through questioning and discovery. However, the Hounds of Galawain specifically, this quasi-religious order, they do focus on actual hunting in the wilderness. So you do have to do that if you're going to join them. Okay, that's all for today. That went a little longer than I thought it was. I actually had a lot more that I wanted to go through, but I guess I apologize. I misjudged how much time I would need. So there are a few other factions within the Deerwood themselves that we want to talk about, and then there's a whole bunch that come from Pillars of Eternity 2, and a lot of the ones from Pillars of Eternity 2 are just found in the book. All the ones that we talked about here, you kind of interact with at least a little bit in Pillars of Eternity 1, but it's interesting to kind of sit back and talk about how they actually operate. In the next episode, we'll talk a little bit more about a couple of druidic circles that exist within Pillars of Eternity 1. Maybe I'll even bring some out from Pillars of Eternity 2. But most notably, the Ethic Null, a druidic order of dwarves that exist in the Glonfathan tribes that are all about ritual sacrifice. And the Ovates of the Golden Grove, which is another druidic order in the Glonfathan tribes. And we'll talk about both of them as well. And to close off this particular section of the show, I am going to read from a journal entry of Malith Doemenal, obviously of House Doemenal that we talked about earlier. A petitioner visited yesterday with his story of hardship, a shopkeeper pushed out of his trade. By the way he clutched his cap over his heart and spoke his milords, he put on all the airs of an honest man. Apparently his morality weren't enough to satisfy the taxman. When they saw the color of our coin, they took everything, my lord, everything. I already knew his story, for it was a common one. Man makes a living, bigger man wants a slice. Way of the world, as my grandfather learned. Pitiful enough that you would have had to answer a monster not to sympathize with him. Except for one bit. He found his way to my court, and he weren't such an honest man, after all. You owned your shop, I said, but the city owned you all along. He agreed too quickly. I decided that I didn't like him. And how do you think I can help you? We can help each other, my lord. He ticked off his fingers as he counted. I have connections in the harbor that go back generations. So do I didn't say. I mentally gave him 1 minute to tell me something interesting. Mother taught us not to play with our food at the table. When your table is an upended fish crate under a sewer grating, propriety tends to fall by the wayside. I know which of the merchants are, he attempted to appear hesitant, unprincipled. So do I. I have access to goods you can't readily find, even in Defiance Bay. So do I. To this I gestured that he continue. Powders, herbs, gadgets that the Brackenberry types would like to get their hands on. Then he hesitated. People? It's amazing what you discover when you reduce a man to his component parts. And there you have it, a journal entry from House Doemenal. I think the point of this little journal entry is to outline kind of the shady interactions that House Doemenal individuals incorporate, and the fact that this person kind of broke down to a point where he was willing to help this group of people, even with, it looks like slave trade, I guess. Who knows? But yeah, so there's that. And now we get into the last part of the show where we discuss what about this stuff in Avowed.
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
Well, when it comes to the 3 or 4 factions within Defiance Bay itself, so House Doemenal, Knights of the Crucible, the Dozens, and Dunryd Row, probably not going to see that much. I mean, we might see some of the Dunryd Row in Avowed, depending on where the game is played, of course. But if it's not played within the Dyrwood or somewhere on the Eastern Reach continent where the Dyrwood Nation is found, we're not really going to interact with a lot of these factions, I would guess, especially if the game is set before Pillars of Eternity. That being said, the Hounds of Galawain or the Hand Occult, they could have origins in other countries. There might be some sort of ancestral religious group or organization that these ones come from, and we could interact with a form of them, or we could interact with the founders of some of these. So that is something that we could see in the game. And again, we don't know where the game is played. I know a lot of people say it's the Living Lands, but until it's officially announced, I am personally going to assume anything is up in the air and available. So we will see. All right, as you can hear, my son is starting to get a little antsy, so I'm going to have to get off the show. Thanks, everyone, for joining me today and my boy as we talk about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. As we gear up for the release of it, we've been talking about different political and religious factions, but mostly just political ones today, that we see in Pillars of Eternity 1. I'm excited to see what unique factions and organizations that will exist within the game of Avowed. And I'm curious to know from you guys if you're interested in seeing any of the factions talked about today or any of the other ones you know about from Pillars of Eternity. Or what original ideas you have yourself for factions, religious or political or otherwise, that could exist in Avowed. Like, what do you think based on some of the rumors or where or when the game might be played? What are some ideas that you have? Maybe we can talk about them on the show. Who knows? Maybe someone at Obsidian might be listening and might inspire something they do. You never know. Never know. If you want to get a hold of me, you can reach me on Twitter at World of Eora, or better yet, you can email me, worldofeora@gmail.com. Those are the primary ways to reach me. I love having conversations. I love answering questions. I even love getting corrected because I don't want to have false information in my brain or give you any misinformation. So yeah, I would really appreciate that. Thanks to everyone who's been emailing and corresponding with me. It's been very enjoyable. I'm starting to work on developing a game, a Dungeons and Dragons game set in Eora. So that's been fun, especially conferring with other creative types to develop that. Anyways, the last piece of news is, if you haven't already heard, I have a Pillars of Eternity 1 Let's Play out on YouTube. If you look for my channel, Gingerino42, you can find it on there. I have an episode that comes out every 3 days. The main point of that Let's Play is primarily for those who are interested in Avowed and want to know about the world, but you're not interested in Pillars of Eternity as a game itself, but you do want to see it firsthand. So that's primarily for you. There's only going to be 17 episodes, so it's not like 100-something episodes like a lot of the other Let's Plays. It's just a Critical Path playthrough. Go check it out. It's my first Let's Play. Let me know how it goes, what you think about it, and offer criticisms and praises as accordingly. Thank you guys so much. It's been awesome sitting here talking with you guys about this. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.